In Episode 9, titled Legal Docs You Must Recognize, we're going to talk about something that is not glamorous, but is absolutely core to professional penetration testing: the paperwork that defines authority, responsibility, and risk management. Pen Test Plus questions regularly test whether you understand that permission is not a vibe and not a technical condition. It is a documented relationship that must be clear enough to defend. These documents protect the client by setting expectations and boundaries, and they protect the tester by proving what was authorized, what was promised, and what must be handled carefully. They also reduce operational confusion, because a surprising number of testing problems come from mismatched assumptions about scope, deliverables, and evidence handling. By the end, you should be able to recognize the role each document plays and understand how it changes what you can do next in a scenario. A statement of work is best understood as the detailed plan and deliverables for a specific engagement. It describes what work will be performed, what will be delivered, and often how success will be measured, which turns abstract testing into a concrete service. The statement of work typically aligns targets, timelines, and responsibilities, and it can include constraints like approved testing windows, reporting expectations, and the level of depth the client expects. On exam scenarios, the statement of work matters because it clarifies what you are there to accomplish and what the client will accept as completion. It also prevents scope drift by tying the engagement to specific outputs, so you are not improvising deliverables midstream. When a question asks what document defines deliverables and engagement details, the statement of work is usually the anchor because it is the most project-specific agreement. A master's service agreement is different because it governs the long-term business relationship rather than the details of a single test. Think of it as the umbrella contract that establishes general terms, responsibilities, and governance for work that may happen repeatedly over time. The master service agreement typically covers business-level elements like payment terms, general responsibilities, dispute resolution, and overarching legal terms that apply across many statements of work. In practice, the master service agreement creates a stable foundation so each new engagement does not need to renegotiate the entire relationship from scratch. On the exam, the key distinction is that the master service agreement is broader and longer term, while the statement of work is specific and engagement-focused. If a scenario describes a recurring relationship between a provider and a client with many projects, the master service agreement is usually the document that defines that relationship. A non-disclosure agreement, often called an NDA, defines confidentiality rules for information handling. Its purpose is to specify what information is considered confidential, who is allowed to see it, how it must be protected, and what happens if confidentiality is violated. In penetration testing, an NDA is not optional theater because the work can expose sensitive details about systems, weaknesses, and data that could create harm if mishandled. On exam questions, an NDA often appears indirectly through references to confidentiality expectations, restrictions on sharing findings, or obligations to protect evidence artifacts. The NDA also shapes how you communicate with third parties because you may not be allowed to discuss details outside authorized channels. When you see prompts emphasizing confidentiality or controlled disclosure, the NDA is the document that explains why those rules exist and how strict they must be. An authorization letter is one of the most operationally important documents because it is explicit permission to perform approved activities. It proves that you are allowed to conduct specific actions against specified targets under specific constraints, and it is often what you present when a stakeholder challenges your authority. The authorization letter is not a marketing document. It is a permission document, and it matters because technical activity without documented authorization can cross legal and ethical lines quickly. In exam scenarios, authorization often becomes relevant when a target owner, security team, or third party questions what you are doing, or when the environment requires proof that the work is sanctioned. The authorization letter also ties back to rules of engagement because it typically references what is allowed and what is not allowed. When a prompt asks what document grants explicit permission to perform testing, the authorization letter is usually the correct concept. Third-party terms of service constraints are another legal layer you must recognize, especially when platforms or services are owned by someone other than the client. If the client uses a cloud provider, a hosted platform, or an external service, the terms of service can restrict what kinds of testing actions are allowed, even if the client wants you to proceed. This is a common real-world friction point and a common exam topic because it tests whether you understand that authorization from the client may not override third-party rules. Terms of service can prohibit certain activities, require notification, or require specific approvals before testing can occur. In questions, this often appears as third-party hosted language, where the correct answer involves respecting platform rules rather than treating the environment as purely client-owned. When the platform is not yours, the legal boundaries may not be yours to rewrite, and the exam wants you to recognize that. Liability and indemnification language affects how work is conducted because it changes the risk posture around what happens if something goes wrong. Liability clauses define what each party may be responsible for, and indemnification clauses define who protects whom in certain types of claims or damages. In penetration testing, these clauses influence how carefully you manage disruptive activities, how you handle unexpected operational impacts, and how you approach high-risk techniques under time constraints. On the exam, you are not expected to be a contract attorney, but you are expected to understand that legal risk affects operational decisions. If a scenario emphasizes production sensitivity, business continuity, or risk of outage, liability and indemnification concerns are part of why constraints are enforced. Recognizing that these terms influence behavior helps you choose answers that prioritize safety and compliance instead of reckless progress. Data ownership and retention clauses directly shape evidence handling choices because evidence is often sensitive and sometimes legally significant. Data ownership defines who owns collected evidence and findings, and retention clauses define how long evidence can be stored, where it may be stored, and when it must be destroyed. These clauses support confidentiality and reduce exposure, because the longer sensitive evidence exists in storage, the larger the risk of mishandling or breach. On exam questions, data retention and ownership often appear through references to evidence storage, sharing rules, minimum necessary collection, or restrictions on transferring artifacts outside authorized environments. The correct answer is often the one that collects only what is needed and handles it according to defined rules, rather than copying or storing everything for convenience. When you can connect evidence handling decisions to ownership and retention clauses, you demonstrate the professional discipline the exam expects. A major warning point is assuming consent based on emails or verbal approval alone, because informal approvals can be ambiguous, incomplete, or disputed later. The exam is not saying emails are never used, but it is testing whether you understand that permission must be explicit, documented, and aligned with scope and rules of engagement. Informal consent can fail under stress, such as when a system owner sees unusual activity and demands proof, or when an operational issue occurs and stakeholders question what was authorized. Verbal approval can also be misunderstood, and even well-intentioned emails can omit key scope boundaries, methods, or timing constraints. On test questions, if you are asked what to do when authorization is unclear or contested, the safest professional move is to pause and verify through the established documentation path. When you treat authorization as a document, not a conversation, you reduce the risk of acting under assumptions. Now consider a scenario where a target questions your authority and requests proof, because this is exactly the kind of moment where document recognition becomes operational. You are in the middle of an engagement, perhaps conducting a permitted activity, and a security team member or system owner notices what looks like suspicious behavior. They contact you or your sponsor and ask, plainly, who authorized this and what exactly are you allowed to do? This is not the time to argue or to keep working quietly in the background, because continuing without resolving the authority question escalates risk. The scenario is not primarily technical. It is governance and trust under pressure. The exam often uses this setup to see whether you respond like a professional partner with clear proof, or like an operator hoping nobody notices. The correct response is to present authorization, pause work until the issue is resolved, and notify stakeholders through the agreed escalation path. Presenting authorization means providing the explicit documentation that proves permission, not simply asserting that a manager said it was okay. Pausing work matters because it prevents unapproved activity while the question is being settled, and it reduces the chance of an operational incident being blamed on continued testing. Notifying stakeholders matters because the engagement sponsor and appropriate contacts need to coordinate with the concerned party and confirm what is allowed, what is in scope, and what timing constraints apply. On exam questions, the best answer often emphasizes controlled communication and documentation, because that is what preserves trust and keeps the engagement legally and ethically sound. When you can clearly state, "Here is the authorization for these activities against these targets," you diffuse confusion and protect everyone. Document mismatches create confusion because different documents can define different parts of the engagement, and it is possible for them to disagree if they were not aligned carefully. A common mismatch is when scope details in a statement of work differ from what an authorization letter permits, or when a third-party terms of service restriction limits activities that the client assumed were allowed. Another mismatch occurs when confidentiality and retention obligations in an NDA or retention clause are not reflected in how evidence is being handled operationally. In exam terms, the right action when documents mismatch is typically to pause, clarify, and align documentation, rather than forging ahead based on whichever document is most convenient. The reason is simple. Mismatches are not merely administrative. They create legal ambiguity, and legal ambiguity is risk. Recognizing mismatches and responding with discipline is part of demonstrating professional competence. Here is the mini-review you want to carry forward by pairing each document with its primary purpose statement in plain language. The statement of work defines the specific plan, scope details, and deliverables for the engagement, making the work measurable and bounded. The Master Service Agreement defines the broader long-term business relationship terms that apply across many engagements. The Non-Disclosure Agreement defines confidentiality rules for handling sensitive information and limiting disclosure. The Authorization Letter provides explicit permission to perform approved activities against specified targets under defined constraints. Third-party terms of service define additional constraints when platforms are owned externally and client permission is not enough to override them. Liability, indemnification, And data ownership and retention clauses shape how cautiously work is conducted and how evidence is collected, stored, shared, and destroyed. In this episode, the key point is that these documents are not background noise. They are the operational foundation that defines what you can do, what you must protect, and how risk is managed. The Statement of Work and Master Service Agreement define different layers of the business relationship, while the NDA defines confidentiality obligations that shape communication and evidence handling. The authorization letter is your proof of permission, and third-party terms of service can impose additional constraints even when the client is supportive. Liability, indemnification, and data retention and ownership clauses influence decisions about disruption, safety, and how long sensitive artifacts should exist. Practice explaining these roles in plain speech once today, because being able to state what this document is for without jargon is how you stay calm and credible when authority is questioned. When you can recognize the documents and apply them to decisions, you answer exam questions like someone who understands that professionalism is as much governance as it is technique. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.